The night was thick with darkness, the gas station lights casting a cruel, mocking glow. 3 police officers approached, faces twisted with contempt, guns tapping rhythmically against their hips. Sergeant Miller growled through clenched teeth, "Black trash. Where'd you steal this car from?" The man stood still, eyes heavy like smoldering coals, but the cold snap of handcuffs clamped down on his wrists. In their brazen stares, silence struck like a slap to the face of justice. That night, around 11 o'clock, the suburban road was nearly empty, only the wind rushing through, carrying the burnt smell of fresh asphalt. A small gas station sat at the corner, its yellow lights spilling over the patchy pavement, reflecting old gasoline stains like scars that hadn't healed. Darius Cole pulled up in a sleek black car, the engine humming low before fading into sudden silence. He wore a simple button-down shirt with a light jacket, calm as he gripped the pump handle, eyes fixed on the blinking numbers. The late night was peaceful, but that peace didn't last long. From a distance, another engine roared, white headlights sweeping across the station. A patrol car screeched to a halt, red and blue lights flashing across the ground. 3 officers stepped out, boots thudding hard against the concrete, each step shattering the silence on purpose. Leading them was Sergeant Miller, a sharp-faced man with eyes as cold as blades, followed by 2 younger officers, one tall and lanky, the other broad and heavy-set, both squinting at Darius, all their eyes locked on him, as if they were staring down a wanted criminal, not a quiet middle-aged man filling up his tank. Miller walked up, stopping right next to the pump. He looked over the shiny car, then up at Darius, a sneer crawling across his face. "Black man in a new ride? Fits the dirty money type." His voice hit hard, each word meant to leave a mark. Behind him, the 2 other officers chuckled dryly, one muttering, "Probably laundering cash or stole it somewhere." The air turned thick, and the yellow light made it worse, like a small stage where authority in uniform played its part. Darius stayed silent, his dark eyes steady, one hand firm on the nozzle. For a second, he thought about pulling out his wallet, showing ID to prove who he was, but the tone in Miller's voice stopped him. He knew these men didn't want papers or proof. They wanted to humiliate him, to break him, to see him lower his head. One of the younger officers circled to the back of the car, tapped the trunk, then growled, "Fancy car, plain-looking owner." Darius let out a quiet breath, not from fear, but from the weight in the air. He felt like he was standing in mud, where logic would twist and silence might be the last thread of dignity left. Miller didn't like that calmly. He stepped in closer, jabbed a finger into Darius's chest, voice sharper. "What are you staring at? Want to walk home tonight?" The words landed like an invisible slap. Darius frowned slightly, a cold flicker in his gaze, but when he lowered his head, reached into his pocket, and slowly pulled out his wallet. He handed over his license and registration, his hand steady, no tremble. Miller took them, glanced briefly, then sneered, "Cole, sounds impressive, but you're still just a black guy driving a fancy car." Another car pulled into the station. A middle-aged couple stepped out, and the moment the woman saw the scene, she quickly tugged her husband toward the convenience store, her eyes shifting away as if escaping an invisible threat. Darius caught that glance, and a flicker of bitterness passed over him. To them, he wasn't a victim. He was the problem. The shadow of prejudice hung in the air, swallowing all sound except for the heavy footsteps and the officers' growling voices. Miller handed back the documents, not into Darius's hand, but deliberately dropped them onto the grimy ground. "Pick it up, then kneel, and thank me for not throwing you in the trunk." A low chuckle came from one of his men. Darius looked down at the dust-covered paper, closed his eyes briefly, and clenched his hand. A moment stretched endlessly, then he bent down, picked up the document, brushed it off, and stood tall without saying a word. That calm only fueled Miller's irritation. "Hard to break, huh? That face really pisses me off," Miller said, signaling to his partners. In that instant, the sound of metal snapping open rang out, and a pair of shining cuffs appeared in his hand. Before Darius could react, the cuffs locked around his wrists, the cold steel clamping shut with a harsh click. A bystander started to reach for his phone, but when he met the glare of the heavy-set officer, he backed off immediately and shoved the phone into his pocket. Other eyes glanced over briefly, then dropped away as their owners hurried off as if fleeing the station. That indifference cut deeper than any insult. Darius was yanked back, his spine hitting the cold body of the car. Miller leaned in close, breath thick with coffee and cigarettes, voice rough. "Tonight, you belong to us." The words echoed inside Darius's head, pounding with each heartbeat. His fists clenched tight, but his gaze stayed steady and silent. In that moment, he knew this wasn't the first time, and likely not the last, but the humiliation wouldn't end at this gas station reeking of fuel and bathed in faded yellow light. When Miller shoved Darius into the back seat of the patrol car, the slamming door drew a sharp line between two worlds. One belonged to the uniformed men who treated humiliation as sport, the other to the man pulled into a spiral of injustice with no one to speak for him. The night remained thick with darkness. The gas station fell quiet again, only the thin gleam of oil reflecting the pale yellow light, as if nothing had happened, as if justice had been dragged away with the clink of iron cuffs. The sound of iron cuffs still echoed in his ears as Miller yanked Darius's arm, forcing him flat against the car. The night air thickened, patrol headlights casting harsh beams that lit up his composed but tense face. Miller gave a curt signal, and the two other officers moved toward Darius's car. They flung the doors open, bent deep inside, and began a rough search like they were tearing apart a wild nest. Seats were ripped through, the glove box overturned, personal items scattered, hitting the oil-stained cement with dull thuds. A fountain pen rolled away, its metallic glint catching the light strangely, like a reminder that order was being crushed underfoot. Meanwhile, Darius was still held tight, arms locked rigid in cold steel. He watched each of his belongings hit the ground, a tightness rising in his chest, but his face stayed still. Any reaction now would be an excuse for them to add another charge. His eyes moved slowly from Miller standing squarely in front of him to the two officers rummaging with zeal. One of them pulled out a leather folder, raising it like a trophy. The cover bore a law school logo with neatly written notes showing under the yellow light. The younger officer squinted, read a line, then let out a mocking laugh that echoed into the quiet. "Law? Someone like you belongs in a cell." He shook the folder in the air, letting a few pages fall loosely to the ground, his voice thick with mockery like he'd just exposed a sad joke. Miller glanced over and smirked, then leaned in, lowering his voice right beside Darius's ear, his breath reeking of cigarettes. "You hear that? No matter how smart you think you are, you'll always be beneath us." The words stabbed deep, aimed to shred the pride Darius had built through years of effort. Every moment he had stood for justice trampled into mud. But Darius didn't reply. His eyes were steady as steel, locked straight ahead, showing not even a flicker of doubt. That silence only aggravated Miller more, who slammed his palm onto the car roof with a loud crack that broke through the night. A young couple who had just finished pumping gas stood a few meters away. The man raised his phone, lens quietly aimed at the scene, his hand trembling slightly, eyes showing a mix of anger and fear. The woman beside him tugged at his sleeve, whispering nervously, but he kept the phone up, trying to capture the moment. Miller caught the glow of the screen and turned sharply, his glare sharp as a blade. One look was enough. The young man shrank back, eyes lowered, phone quickly silenced and shoved into his pocket. His hand still shook, heart pounding, but he couldn't hold his ground. The couple hurried off, their figures swallowed by the night, leaving behind a silence even heavier than before. Miller turned back, his lips curling into a satisfied grin, like a man who had just confirmed his absolute power. "See that? No one here's gonna save you." He spoke loudly, his voice echoing through the empty gas station, a public declaration meant to humiliate. Darius heard every word clearly, but in his eyes burned a terrifying calm. It wasn't submission, but a quiet restraint. like steel in a furnace, waiting for the right moment to harden into form. The two officers had pulled nearly everything out of the car, dumping it into a scattered pile on the ground. A few books, a folder of documents, and some personal items lay strewn about, all treated like trash. Miller nodded, signaling, and one of them grabbed Darius by the shoulder, shoving him hard toward the back door of the patrol car. The sudden push made him stumble slightly, but he straightened quickly, his expression unchanged. The other officer flung the door open, revealing the dark, cramped black leather seat inside. That space looked no different from a trap waiting to snap shut. Miller leaned in, gripped the back of Darius's neck, and forced him to duck into the back seat. His tall frame twisted awkwardly into the tight space, the metal cuffs clinking every time his wrists hit the seat's edge. When the door slammed shut, the heavy thud sounded like a full stop, severing any last hope for justice in this place. The yellow light from the gas station still lit his face through the window glass. Darius's eyes did not flinch, did not panic, only held a cold, unblinking stare, cutting through the darkness, cutting through the men who had just humiliated him. Tonight, silence was the only weapon he had, but it wasn't silence without end. For a moment, Miller caught that stare. He froze for half a beat, then quickly turned away, clearing his throat and barking orders at his team. But that look stayed lodged in his mind like a warning, a slow-burning fire that no badge or title could extinguish. And as the patrol car rolled away from the gas station, leaving behind the stench of fuel and a mess of scattered belongings, the air itself seemed to twist with tightly wound anger, waiting for its day to erupt. The patrol car sped through the night, red and blue lights spilling across the sidewalk like cold, sharp cuts. Inside, Darius sat motionless, arms pinned behind him, wrists burning and swollen from the crushing grip of the cuffs. Every jolt over a pothole drove metal against skin, leaving behind a sting of raw pain. He lifted his head, eyes staring out the window, where trees blurred past in the dark and wind tapped against the glass like scattered rain. No one spoke in the car, only the low murmur of the night news on the radio, drowned out by Miller's irritated drumming on the steering wheel. When the car came to a stop, a dry click broke the silence. The door flung open, and Miller yanked Darius out. The holding station appeared, a square block of aging concrete under pale fluorescent light. He was dragged down a narrow hallway, the thick smell of bleach choking the air, each boot step echoing off stained walls. A few detainees peered out from behind bars, their eyes dull, then dropped back down as if nothing here ever changed. The cell for Darius was small and stained with damp patches, a single flickering tube light casting a harsh glare that revealed every scratch and scuff. The iron door groaned open, and he was shoved inside, stumbling into the opposite bars. The cuffs came off, but the bruises they left had already turned purple, blood seeping in tiny lines at his wrists. He looked up, scanning the cramped space. A cold metal bench, a rusted sink, and scribbled carvings on the wall that marked the weariness of those who came before. Outside the bars, Miller sat at a steel desk, flicked on a lamp, and began scribbling his report. Each scratch of the pen sounded sharp and jagged. He glanced up, smirked, and muttered with thick sarcasm, "Bet your parents are real proud they raised a criminal." The words weren't shouted, but they cut deep, sinking slowly into the stale air of the room. The two younger officers standing nearby burst into laughter, eyes lit with satisfaction at watching Miller humiliate a man who could not fight back. Darius remained silent, his breathing steady, but inside him a tide was rising. He stepped slowly toward the bars, reached out, and gripped the cold steel. His grip tightened until the skin split, blood welling at his knuckles. Still, he didn't let go, each drop falling to the floor like red ink marking a buried fury. His eyes locked onto Miller, not with defiance or pleading, but with absolute resolve. That gaze made Miller pause briefly, then cover it with a soft scoff as he looked back down and kept writing. Time dragged heavily. The ticking of the wall clock echoed, and the harsh white light made the whole room feel like a sealed box, stifling and airless. The earlier laughter had faded, leaving only the scratch of pen on paper and the lonely sigh of a prisoner in the next cell. Darius let go of the bars. Blood streaked across his palm, and he stepped back, sitting down on the cold metal bench, his eyes never leaving the three men in blue. In his mind, every insult etched deep, every mocking laugh struck hard, but none of it broke him. Instead, it hardened his resolve. When Miller finished writing, he snapped the folder shut and stood. He walked up to the bars, tapping the metal with the end of his pen, his voice smug. "You think you're smart, with your law books and schooling, but here you are, sitting like all the other trash." Darius's gaze was ice cold, silent like stone. That calm made Miller turn away in irritation. He jerked his head, signaling one of the younger officers. The officer stepped forward and yanked the heavy door closed. The sound of the iron door slamming echoed through the room, metal crashing against metal, sealing off the tiny space. Darkness crept out from the corners, swallowing Darius whole. Footsteps faded down the hall, leaving behind only the lingering clang of steel, a sound that etched itself into memory. He sat still in the cramped cell, the white light casting down over his bowed head, his hands still smeared with blood. The room was drowning in silence, but in his chest, his heart beat strong, a quiet reminder that this darkness was temporary, and the truth could not be locked away forever. The next morning, faint sunlight slipped through the small high window, casting harsh white streaks across the stained cell. Darius sat with his back against the cold wall, head slightly tilted, eyes half closed, though his mind stayed alert. He hadn't slept all night. The sound of boots pacing and keys turning in locks echoed without pause. He didn't expect an apology, nor did he hope for any kind of explanation. The only thing he knew for certain was that the humiliation of the previous night would stay etched forever, and it would outlive any fabricated report. When the cell door opened, Miller appeared with a face like stone. He held a stack of papers, waving them as if they carried a sentence, then tossed them onto a hallway desk without a glance. "No charges. You're free to go," he said flatly, his voice dry. He stepped closer, leaned in, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "Watch yourself out there. You won't always be this lucky." His words weren't a warning. They were a blow aimed straight at pride. They echoed down the long corridor, slid into every cold crack in the brick, drowning the space in shame. The two young officers behind Miller snickered, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. They unlocked the cuffs, and Darius's hands were free, but red welts still burned around his wrists, dried blood darkening into thick brown lines. He stepped out slowly, offering no reply, his eyes never meeting Miller's, looking straight through him as if he were nothing. That calm sparked a flicker of anger in Miller's eyes, but he said nothing, only stepped aside to let him pass. Outside the station, daylight had fully broken, pale yellow sunlight stretching across the sidewalk. A small crowd lingered, most waiting on paperwork or visiting detained relatives. As Darius stepped into view, a few curious glances passed over him, then dropped quickly as if afraid to witness something forbidden. An older man pulled his son aside, avoiding eye contact, muttering something before pretending to scroll through his phone. A young woman, waiting in the distance, glanced briefly, her eyes catching the bruises on his wrists, but she lowered her head, tugged her hat down, and turned away. No one asked if he was okay. No one dared come close. Darius walked past the crowd, each step steady, his posture composed. Every footfall struck the tiled ground with weight, echoing clearly through the still morning. Inside him, fury swelled, held tight, a silent lava flow under the surface. The silence of the crowd weighed heavily than any insult. It confirmed that, in their eyes, this injustice was routine routine, just another scene they chose to ignore. A worn, gray car waited by the curb. The driver hunched low in the seat. Darius walked over without a word, opened the door himself, and sat in the back. As the door shut, the outside world seemed to disappear. In the silence, he lifted his hand and turned his wrist under the light. The deep red marks were still there, clear and raw, stretched like a ring of heated wire. He held his wrist up toward the rearview mirror, studying it closely. The reflection showed dark eyes burning with restraint, the skin around his wrist swollen. In that moment, Darius understood those marks weren't just physical. They were evidence of contempt, a reminder that this system allowed people to crush others under the guise of authority. He placed his hand on the seat, fingers clenched until the knuckles turned white. In the mirror, his eyes were cold as steel, reflecting a strength that had taken shape. The car moved, gliding past streets still touched by morning mist. Pedestrians, workers, and students emerged one by one, life resuming as if nothing had happened. But inside that narrow space, Darius sat still, letting the memories of the night churn, every mocking laugh, every cruel word echoing again. The silence of the crowd, the lowered faces, the turning eyes, all of it combined into an unwritten verdict. He knew those people didn't all side with Miller, but fear had made them stay quiet, and it was that silence that fed the cruelty. When the car stopped at a red light, the glow spread over Darius's face, casting a heavy shade. He took a deep breath, then closed his eyes, trying to dam the flood of memory. But Miller's image stayed vivid. The sneer, the venom in his voice, the way he said, "You won't always be this lucky," still echoed. It wasn't just a threat, it was a statement of a system where uniforms believed they were untouchable. Darius opened his eyes and stared into the rearview mirror. In that reflection, he saw his own gaze, deep and cold. There was nothing left of the trembling from the night before, only a hardened will, a quiet fire. The mark around his wrist was a reminder, and a scar that demanded justice. The car turned onto the road leading to the city center, where tall buildings rose in the morning light. Darius sat upright, his face resolute. He didn't know exactly what was ahead, but inside him a resolve had formed. The silence of the crowd had placed him in a role he couldn't walk away from. He had to become the voice for that silence, had to turn that bruise on his wrist into proof of a truth no one could deny. And when the car stopped at the stone steps of a large building, sunlight had already covered the entire city, erasing the darkness of the night before, but not what had been carved into his memory. Darius stepped out, his shoes striking the stone, each step echoing, each one a clear declaration. That silence would never again be enough to bury justice. The morning light flooded the high-floor office of the federal building, revealing a world entirely different. Thick navy velvet curtains swayed gently in the early breeze, parting just enough to show the clear blue sky beyond the window. Inside, everything was arranged with precise care. Dark wooden bookshelves stretched along the walls, folders stacked neatly on the desk, and hanging near the wall was the long black judge's robe, heavy and solemn, a symbol of power and responsibility that only a few ever wore in a lifetime. In the stillness, Darius's footsteps echoed softly but firmly. He set his leather briefcase on the desk, slowly unbuttoned his shirt, the fabric pulling away to reveal bruises still fresh. His wrists were swollen and red with shallow cuts, his shoulders mottled with purple marks from being shoved against the car the night before. The wounds weren't just on his skin, they were etched deep into his pride. He stood before the large mirror, the light casting sharp edges across his resolute face. His eyes held both clarity and a restrained fury. He touched his wrist, the ache still pulsing faintly, then slowly turned his gaze to the black robe hanging nearby. In that moment, the room seemed to bridge two worlds. One, the night of humiliation, and the other, the daylight of legal authority. Darius stepped forward, slid off his crumpled shirt, revealing the full extent of the bruises, and pulled the robe over his shoulders. The heavy fabric settled around him, its weight grounding him, lending presence. He stood tall, staring at his reflection. The image, looking back, was no longer the man in cuffs dragged through the night, but a federal judge, one of the few few with the power to shape justice itself. He took a deep breath, his voice calm but firm as it filled the silent room. Justice does not sleep, it only waits to awaken. The words felt like a vow, a message sent straight into the darkness that had surrounded him. It wasn't comfort, it was conviction. Justice, even when trampled, still held the strength to rise. A knock sounded at the door, urgent yet respectful. His clerk stepped in, holding a thick file, tension written across her face. Judge Cole, the Federal Disciplinary Board, has issued an official statement. The officers involved in last night's incident have been summoned to court. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were full of trust as she looked at the man in the robe. Darius took the file and flipped through the pages. Printed clearly were the names of the men he had just faced: Sergeant Miller, Jacob Harris, and Owen Blake. Each line of text is a precise piece in a justice now shifting direction. Darius sat down, his hand resting firmly on the file. He recalled every mocking word, every smug laugh, every look of disdain. All of it would now be brought into the light of the law, not for revenge, but to prove that justice could not be bent by uniform or false authority. He closed his eyes for a moment, slowed his breath, then opened them to stare at the bold printed text. In his gaze, was no resignation, only resolve. A fire lit by wounds that still bled. The sharp ring of the desk phone cut through the silence. Darius picked up. On the other end was the voice of a council commissioner, short and firm. Judge Cole, you will preside over their hearing. He gave a slight nod, set the phone down, his eyes still fixed on the file. Last night, he was the victor this morning. He held the authority to decide. That shift wasn't just ironic, it was proof that truth could flip the entire board in a moment. Darius stood and stepped onto the office balcony. From there, he looked down at the plaza in front of the building, where people rushed through the new morning. They passed each other, caught in the rhythm of daily life, unaware that inside this very courthouse, a battle for justice was about to begin. He placed a hand on the railing, the marks on his wrist glowing red under the sun, like a seal pressed onto a mission. He understood that this fight wasn't just between him and Miller. It was between justice and corruption, between silence and courage. Back at his desk, he opened his notebook and began writing the first lines of the case file. Each word, each stroke of the pen struck like steel, carving into his resolve. He wasn't writing for revenge, but to ensure that men like Miller would understand justice had eyes and no one stood above the law. When he set the pen down, he leaned back in his chair, looking at the robe covering his frame, his eyes burning with pride. The clerk returned, this time carrying an official notice. The hearing will be held tomorrow morning in courtroom 1. She placed the paper on the desk, then stepped back. Darius looked at the bold text, his heart pounding in his chest. Tomorrow, in that room, he would face Miller and his colleagues, not in the shadows, not under dim yellow lights, but in the full daylight of justice. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The battle had truly begun. Outside, the clock tower chimed, its sound echoing through the courthouse halls. Darius stood, lifting the case file, his gaze sharp as steel. He knew that every detail of that humiliating night would be examined. No more silence to cover it, no more bowed heads to ignore it. The marks the cuffs had left on his wrists would now serve as evidence, stripping away the masks of those who believed they could forever stand above others. In the final moment of the morning, as sunlight poured through the window, Darius looked once more into the mirror. The man, staring back, was no longer the one cornered and shamed, but a symbol of resistance and justice. He spoke softly, almost a whisper. Tomorrow, justice will speak. The words faded into the room, but their echo lingered, carried by the tolling bell. And then, the official summons was sent. Sergeant Miller and his team would stand trial under the authority of the very man they tried to break the night before. That morning, As Darius returned to his office to prepare for the hearing, an undercurrent was quietly taking shape elsewhere. In a small apartment, just a few blocks from the gas station, a college student sat at his desk, hands trembling as he held his phone. The night before, while secretly recording Miller and his team arresting Darius, he had nearly dropped the device when Miller's hostile glare shot in his direction. After slipping away, he lay awake all night, haunted by the image of a man cuffed without cause and mocked with cruel laughter. He wondered if he had the courage to release the clip, if the police would come to his door, if his family might be dragged into it. But as morning light filled the room, anger overcame fear. He opened his phone, and the video loaded clearly. In the grainy frame under yellow light, Miller shoved Darius hard against the car, cuffing him with the sharp clank of metal. Then came the sneering voice of the young officer. "Law? Someone like you belongs in a cell." The sound was crisp, undeniable. He took a deep breath and typed a simple title: Southridge Police Arrest a Man at a Gas Station. Then he hit upload on the most popular social platform. The screen displayed "Uploading," and his heart pounded out of rhythm. Within minutes, the clip was shared hundreds of times, first by classmates, then their friends, then total strangers. Likes and comments poured in. Someone wrote, "This is how cops behave." Another added, "Disgraceful. He thinks he can do whatever he wants to black people." And then, within an hour, the hashtag gas station justice emerged, spreading like wildfire across dry grass. Tens of thousands began to repost the video, fueled by outrage and demands for justice. Social media moved like a storm. A prominent account in the community posted, "If we stay silent, more people like him will be humiliated tomorrow." The post was shared thousands of times. Every minute, views climbed, past 100,000, then 500,000. Across forums, people discussed the incident, calling it living proof of abuse of power. Every word, every sound from the video struck a nerve, planting fury in viewers' hearts. At the Southridge police station, a young officer scrolling social media stumbled upon the clip and turned pale. He rushed into Miller's office, voice shaky. "Sir, there's a video." Miller leaned back in his chair, feet on the desk, eyes narrowed at his monitor. As the clip played, his face darkened. He heard his colleague's voice echo, "Law? Someone like you belongs in a cell." The room went still. Miller slammed his hand on the desk, papers flying, and roared, "I'm going to find out who filmed this." His voice thundered, eyes burning with rage. The two young officers nearby stayed silent, barely breathing, but Miller knew it couldn't be undone. The clip was too clear to deny, too widespread to erase, and the public had already seized it. Outside, the wave of outrage grew stronger. People reposted the video with biting captions, "This is what they call protecting the public?" or "A judge treated like a criminal. Where is justice?" Miller stared at the screen, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time, he felt the power in his uniform begin to shake. Meanwhile, in his office, Darius sat quietly over the case file. The clerk entered, placing a phone on the desk, its screen lit with countless notifications. "Judge Cole, the video from last night has gone public." He picked it up and played it. His own image filled the frame, eyes cold and helpless, laughter in the background, insults, the sound of cuffs snapping shut, all of it captured in seconds, yet carrying the weight of a humiliating night. Darius stared without blinking. He knew this moment didn't just expose the truth, it launched an open war. Below the video, thousands of people left comments. Some shared similar stories of being pulled over without cause. Others called for protests. Years of pent-up anger finally had somewhere to go, and the name Darius Cole began to appear more and more, not just as a victim, but as a symbol. People didn't know who he was yet, only that he stood there, endured humiliation, and stayed silent like steel. That silence enraged them even more. The views kept climbing, and the hashtag gas station justice reached the #1 trending spot. Local news began covering the story, replaying the video, inviting social commentators to weigh in. One said, "We are witnessing a historic moment. when evidence can't be buried." Another added, "That line in the video says it all. It wasn't a slip, it was the truth showing itself." Public reaction burned like a wildfire, spreading into every corner. Inside Miller's office, the air tightened like a drawn string. He paced while phones rang non-stop, reporters calling, media demanding statements, higher-ups flooding him with messages. "Stay quiet. Say nothing," one senior official wrote quickly. But Miller growled, slamming his fist into the wall. "Silence will kill us. We have to find who filmed it." He turned to his team, voice low and harsh. "Search everything. Scan every camera. Track every trace. I want to know who dared." At that moment, in a small apartment, the student had unplugged his phone, turned off the lights, and sat still in the dark, heart racing. He feared Miller might come for him, but as he watched the screen, where hundreds of thousands were now sharing his clip, fear slowly gave way to something stronger, a belief that truth had already escaped the grip of those in uniform. He exhaled and whispered, "At least they saw." Elsewhere in the city, those who had silently witnessed the gas station incident now scrolled through social media, recognizing the exact moment they had looked away, now exposed to the world. Some felt guilt. Some tried to avoid it, but none could deny that the truth had surfaced. And once the wheels of justice begin to turn, they are not easily stopped. In just one night, the short video recorded at the gas station spread beyond the borders of a small town, reaching across the nation at lightning speed. Major news networks opened their morning broadcasts with the image of Miller pinning Darius against the car, and the line, "Law, someone like you belongs in a cell," played clearly, an undeniable piece of evidence. On screen, a banner scrolled, "Police abuse of power," alongside larger questions. Was this an isolated incident, or a mirror reflecting a decaying system? The anchor, with a measured tone, posed it directly. If an educated man can be treated like a criminal, what hope is there for those without the means to defend themselves? The coverage intensified, with even smaller outlets seizing the moment. A local news reporter tracked down a witness present at the station that night, a middle-aged man who had considered recording but lowered his phone and walked away. On camera, he stammered, I saw them cuff him and yell, but I was scared. I thought if I stepped in, they'd do it to me too." That clip aired quickly and spread online. It sparked a surge of anger. A truth exposed. Fear had bound people into silence and made them bystanders. His trembling confession became one of the flashpoints fueling public outrage. On social media, a fierce war of words erupted. One side defended the officers, claiming there must have been a reason for the arrest, or maybe the clip doesn't show the full story. These comments were widespread, often from accounts with police icons or users identifying as relatives of officers. But the opposing voices surged louder and stronger. People dissected every second of the video, every sneer, every insult, asking, "Is this the full story you're talking about?" One activist wrote, "When the word cell was spoken, it wasn't just personal, it was the voice of a system." Post was shared hundreds of thousands of times, followed by waves of agreement. The divide extended beyond the internet into real life. Debates broke out in coffee shops, on buses, in classrooms. Some defended the police out of a belief in false security, while others were outraged at what they saw as an undeniable injustice. In that atmosphere, the name Darius Cole began to rise as a symbol. Though few knew who he was, they recognized him as the man who endured humiliation in silence. That silence in the video resonated deeply, reminding many of the times they had looked away from injustice, choosing safety over speaking up. The media didn't miss the moment. Headlines appeared in bold, "A slap to justice. Who protects us when police become the threat? Gas station justice. Does justice even exist?" On late-night talk shows, guests, including lawyers, journalists, and activists, took turns weighing in. One lawyer said plainly, "I watched that video and saw my own son in Darius Cole. If he gets pulled over one day, Will he be respected or thrown into a patrol car like that? The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Meanwhile, in the city of Southridge, the streets began to stir. Social groups and long-frustrated grassroots organizations seized the moment. They printed posters, wrote slogans, and held emergency meetings on online forums. A protest call went out. Tomorrow we march. Let them know silence is no longer an option. Within hours, thousands had pledged to join. That night, in the city center, the first crowds gathered. They carried handmade signs, cardboard placards reading "Justice for Darius" and "Stop Police Abuse." Drums beat from the corners, mixed with chants rising in rhythm, "Justice, justice, we want justice." The crowd grew, and the glow from hundreds of raised phones lit up the square. They shouted Darius's name, now a symbol, even as he quietly prepared for the courtroom, unaware that out there, thousands were turning his private humiliation into collective strength. Under the pressure, local officials faltered. A police spokesperson appeared at a brief press conference, attempting to deflect with a vague statement, "We are investigating the matter," but the bland response satisfied no one. Outside, protesters roared, "Investigation isn't enough. We want justice." The chants echoed off the high-rise buildings into the ears of every resident. Public pressure was no longer a ripple. It had become a storm. In the dim back room of a bar, Miller sat slumped over a glass of hard liquor. The TV on the wall replayed protest footage, showing crowds holding signs in defiance. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot. He slammed the glass down, shattering it, and growled, "They think they can take me down?" But deep down, he knew the power was slipping from his hands. In another corner of the city, Darius sat in his quiet office, staring at the computer screen where hundreds of messages and news articles continued to appear. He read the words, "Justice for Darius," with a calm, steady gaze. He understood that what was unfolding was no longer a personal story. The crowd outside had transformed his bitter experience into a much larger fight, and he, as a judge, would be the one expected to deliver a fair conclusion for all. As night fell, the chants still echoed through the streets. "Darius, Darius." That call was not only a show of support, but a reminder. He was not alone, and justice, once awakened, would not go quietly back to sleep. The next morning, while protests still filled the streets and news outlets continued to run stories about the first video, another devastating blow suddenly struck. A second clip surfaced online, this time with clearer quality, clean audio, and visuals so sharp no one could look away. In the frame, Miller's face appeared in full detail, eyes blazing, both hands gripping Darius's shoulders as he slammed him against the patrol car. The loud thud echoed, followed immediately by a harsh shout, "You're just black trash." That sentence hit the ears of millions, no longer a veiled insult or mockery, but a blatant declaration of racism. It ignited social media again, more fiercely than ever before. News platforms quickly picked up the clip. Headlines plastered across homepages, "The Police Unmasked," "Racial Slur in Public View," "Justice Torn Apart Under Yellow Lights." Within hours, the second video passed the million-view mark, spreading at lightning speed. People were outraged, furious, shouting through every comment. One wrote, "We can't be silent anymore. This is America's reality." Another added, "No one deserves to be treated like that, especially in front of a crowd. Justice must be restored." The wave of fury didn't stop at words. Young people turned it into a weapon of language and imagery. Memes flooded the internet, one side showing Miller's furious glare, the other showing Darius in his black robe, overlaid with bold text, "Arrested today, judged tomorrow." The image spread like wildfire, appearing in every share, every article, every commentary video. It became a symbol not just of irony, but of a justice shift no one saw coming. Darius, in the eyes of the public, had become the embodiment of poetic justice everyone longed for. At the Southridge Police Department, chaos erupted. Phones rang non-stop, calls pouring in, voices full of anger. "We demand justice. Hold him accountable. Why are you silent? Hundreds, then thousands of emails flooded the official inbox, all titled with demands to investigate, suspend, and arrest Miller. A duty officer nearly lost control, sweat beading on his forehead as he typed responses and answered calls at once. The entire administrative team scrambled in the storm of public backlash, none able to contain it. The media gathered outside the station, dozens of cameras and microphones raised, aimed at any officer who stepped out. The questions came fast. Are you aware of the second video? Where is Miller now? How are you planning to respond? The spokespeople stammered, offering evasive answers. But, in the eyes of the public, that evasiveness was complicity. The more they dodged, the more trapped they became. A journalist said bluntly on live television, "If they won't act, we will." And those words poured gasoline on the fire. Inside the concrete walls of the police station, Miller sat in his private office, face flushed, veins bulging at his neck. The noise outside echoed in, driving him to the edge. He paced, muttering under his breath, then suddenly slammed his palm on the desk, the impact spilling his glass of water. "I won't let that black bastard humiliate me in front of the whole country," he roared, voice like thunder, hand pounding the wood again and again. The two young officers nearby kept their heads down, saying nothing. They had seen the video, too, had heard every word Miller hurled, and they knew there was no defending it. In their eyes, the power they once believed untouchable was crumbling piece by piece. Outside, the crowd kept growing. Handwritten signs rose high. "Stop police abuse, justice for Darius." The chants blended with drums, horns, and synchronized calls. Groups passed around images, clips, and memes. The entire city seemed to shake. A storm no one could contain. From those who had once stayed silent, a unified voice had emerged, and all of it pointed toward one name: Darius Cole. In his office, Darius sat at his desk, eyes quietly scanning the news feed on screen. He saw himself in the second clip, saw the helpless but unbroken stare, heard again the insult, the cruel laughter. He knew these images were no longer about him alone. They had become evidence of a fractured society, of pain layered over years, and he, by the seat he held, would have to turn that truth into a public judgment. The chants outside echoed into his office. "Justice! Justice!" The sound pounded like a drumbeat. Darius took a deep breath, sat upright, and placed his hand on the thick case file. He understood that from this moment, silence was no longer an option. Once the truth had been brought to light, justice had to awaken, and he would be the one to bring down the gavel so that everyone would know the humiliation would not go unanswered. That morning, while the online storm showed no sign of easing, a major newspaper suddenly published a long article titled, "The Man in the Gas Station Video is Federal Judge Darius Cole." The news spread instantly, sending an already furious public into another wave of outrage. Television broadcasts repeatedly mentioned the name, placing stills from the video beside Darius's official portrait in his judge's robe, eyes stern, expression sharp. The contrast between the two images, one of a man being shoved and cuffed, the other of a legal authority at the peak of power, struck like lightning, leaving the public stunned. Viewers were shocked, many unable to believe what they were reading. Comment sections across forums filled with disbelief. "He's really a judge? They cuffed a representative of justice? If even a federal judge can be treated like that, what hope is left for the rest of us?" The truth intensified the fury that had been building for days, transforming Darius from an anonymous victim into a symbol of justice publicly disgraced. People saw in him not only the face of abuse, but a reflection of a society revealing its own fractures. News channels quickly re-edited their coverage, replaying the footage of the handcuffing, followed by clips of Darius walking through the federal courthouse with the caption, "Honorable Judge Darius Cole." One anchor remarked, "We are witnessing the cruelest reversal, a judge of the justice system trampled by those sworn to protect it." That line was shared widely, appearing in thousands of posts, becoming a defining quote for the unfolding scandal. In the legal world, the reaction was even more intense. Many of Darius's colleagues spoke out publicly. Another judge posted, "I've sat at the same table as Darius. He is principled and unwavering. It's unthinkable that a fellow judge was dragged into the street like a criminal." A law professor stated on television, "This act didn't just offend Darius Cole. It was a blow to the entire legal system." That declaration further inflamed public response, as people realized this wasn't just about a wrongful arrest, but a full-blown crisis of trust. For those who had chanted his name in protest, the revelation was fuel to the fire. Their anger was no longer only about police misconduct, it was about a justice system desecrated from within. Slogans on protest signs quickly evolved from "Justice for Darius" to "Justice for us all," as if to declare that the humiliation of one judge was shared by the whole community. Darius became a symbol, not because he spoke out, but because he was forced into silence while enduring that humiliation, and now that silence had been turned into a roar by the people standing in his place. On the other side, Miller and his team were stunned when the news broke. Inside the police headquarters, the atmosphere turned thick with tension. Officers glancing at one another with worried eyes. Miller slammed the wall, barking, "A judge? Don't tell me that's true." But moments later, the TV in the room broadcast Darius's stern face during his judicial swearing-in. The truth was undeniable. The younger officers stayed silent while Miller clenched his fists, sweat beading at his temples, his eyes bloodshot with fury and fear. To the public, this revelation turned a local scandal into a national disaster. Darius was no longer just a man humiliated at a gas station. He represented the law, the justice system itself. People began asking the bigger question: if a federal judge can be treated this way, what happens to regular citizens? That question cut straight into the already fragile credibility of the police force. Protests intensified, slogans rang louder, and across the media, Darius Cole's image was invoked as undeniable proof truth could not be buried. Once the press confirmed that the man handcuffed at the gas station was indeed federal judge Darius Cole, public focus shifted swiftly to the other side, where the name Sergeant Miller rose to the center of the storm. On social media, thousands began sharing screenshots of his face from the video, accompanied by the call, "Find out who he is." A wave of online investigation began. From small forums to massive groups, people dug into old records, pulled up local news clips, and examined every photo where Miller might appear. Within a single day, a flood of information surfaced. Past arrests, citizen complaints, and internal reports that had quietly disappeared. The public was shocked to learn that Miller wasn't someone who simply lost control or made a mistake, as some still tried to defend. One article laid out at least 5 incidents where his name appeared: a black college student with a broken nose after a stop and search, a single mother who filed a complaint after being verbally abused, and a Latino teenager held for hours without explanation. Stories once forgotten resurfaced and were now pinned to Miller's cold expression, turning him into the face of corruption in uniform. Former witnesses began appearing on TV, their voices shaky but firm. One man recalled, "He made me kneel in the middle of the street in front of everyone just for asking why I was stopped." A woman added bitterly, "I sent a letter to the department. No one answered." Now, people finally see. This isn't new. Anger escalated by the hour. Online, entire pages were created solely to compile Miller's history of abuse, with each post receiving thousands of shares. Investigative journalists dove in, releasing leaked documents. Numerous colleagues had warned that Miller was a violent man, but the department ignored them because of his close ties with superiors. Some memos revealed that Miller had been recommended for suspension at least twice, but the files were quietly shelved. Every detail added fuel to the fire, dragging the reputation of the Southridge Police Department to an unprecedented low. As public outrage surged, television channels repeatedly aired footage of hundreds gathered outside the police station, chanting, "Fire Miller," and justice for all. The department's hotline was overwhelmed. Emails flooded in, and civil rights organizations sent letters directly to state officials, demanding a full investigation. Several politicians were forced to speak out, calling for transparency. The pressure mounted by the minute, and for the first time in years, the machinery that had long shielded Miller began to falter. Inside the second-floor meeting room of the station, the air was heavy. Senior officers sat around a long table, their faces tense. One finally spoke. "We can't stay silent. The press will tear us apart," another said with a hint of sarcasm. "Or let Miller go out there and speak for himself." The room fell silent. Everyone knew if Miller faced the media, his temper would only make things worse. At last, the police chief tapped the table with weary fingers and said, "There's no other way. We have to hold a press conference." News of the upcoming press conference quickly leaked, further inflaming the crowds outside. Television networks announced the time and reporters flooded the station. The public wasn't waiting for an excuse. They wanted an admission. To them, this wasn't just a formality. It was the moment to see whether the police department would confront the truth or bury it beneath the same tired justifications. And in a dark corner of his private office, Miller sat motionless, fists clenched, eyes bloodshot. He knew that when the lights from dozens of microphones and cameras hit him, the mask he had worn would begin to crack. The press room at the Southridge Police Department was packed, dozens of reporters crowding in with microphones, cameras, and blinding lights that made the already stifling atmosphere even more tense. Outside, protesters still hadn't left, their chants for justice pounding against the glass walls, blending with car horns and the steady beat of drums. At the wooden podium, Police Chief Malcolm stepped forward, his face drawn from lack of sleep, uniform neatly pressed, but his eyes betraying clear confusion. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain composure as dozens of lenses pointed at him. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are conducting a thorough internal investigation," he began, his voice heavy. "We fully understand the community's concerns and are committed to getting to the bottom of this matter." The statement sounded scripted, offering no concrete assurance. Below, several reporters raised their hands instantly, flashes firing without pause. A female reporter stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "You say internal investigation, but the video is clear. Can you confirm that the racially charged statement was made by Officer Miller himself?" The chief blinked, glanced down at his notes, and replied evasively, "We will not be commenting until the investigation is complete." The answer poured gasoline on the fire. The room buzzed, more hands shot up, questions firing one after another. "Did you ignore past complaints about Miller? Why has he remained on duty for so long? Will you commit to suspending Miller immediately?" Each question cut deep, exposing years of cover-up. Malcolm wiped sweat from his brow, a strained smile flickered, then faded, his voice starting to tremble. "We will review all records, and, if violations are found, appropriate action will be taken." At that moment, a television reporter switched on a large screen in the middle of the room, playing the second video that had just gone viral. Footage of Miller gripping Darius tightly, the shouted words, "You're just black trash," echoed through the room. Chaos erupted instantly. People leapt to their feet, and cameras zoomed in on Malcolm's pale face. He tried to recover. The video may have been edited, but was immediately shouted down. "The audio is crystal clear. The footage is sharp. What could be edited?" The room descended into disorder, and his excuses carried no weight. In the harsh glare of lights, the police chief looked out at the press rows and saw the growing anger, the contempt rising steadily. He realized this press conference was no longer a place to calm the public, but had turned into a public courtroom, where he and the entire system behind him were now on trial. Outside, protesters chanted in unison, "Justice for Darius! Fire Miller!" The sound crashed down on each vague word like a hammer, leaving Malcolm frozen, unsure how to continue. The press conference ended in chaos. He rushed off the podium, dodging the wave of questions crashing toward him. Reporters pushed forward, shouting after him, flashes popping non-stop, capturing the image of a man who led the police force, yet bowed his head in defeat. The footage aired live almost instantly, headlines reading simply, "Press Conference Collapse, Southridge Police Avoid the Truth." To the public, it was the final proof they needed to know they had been right all along, that the system protected no one, and that Miller and his fellow officers had nowhere left to hide. The noise in the room had already reached a fever pitch when it suddenly fell silent. A veteran journalist from a national network stood, eyes sharp as if cutting through every layer of deception. Without waiting for permission, he plugged a USB drive into the large screen behind the podium. The image appeared instantly, the yellow glow of the gas station lighting up the concrete, Miller pinning Darius down, followed by the harsh shout, "You're just black trash." The words rang out clearly, each syllable hitting the room like a hammer. For a moment, every reporter, staff member, and officer on guard stood frozen, eyes locked on the screen. Soft gasps filled the air. Some covered their mouths, others typed furiously, sending live updates back to their newsrooms. Police Chief Malcolm stood stiff behind the podium, his face contorted, both hands clenched tightly on the wooden surface. He tried to speak, lips moving, but the sound of the clip itself drowned out any excuse. Every word Miller had said burned itself into the air, irrefutable, unerasable, because it came not from rumor or hearsay, but from living proof. Malcolm glanced around, seeing every lens pointed his way, every eye dissecting him, and knew that any denial now would only become a spectacle. In the seats below, a young female reporter rose, her voice loud and clear. "This is the truth. This is no longer about an internal investigation. This is evidence that the entire world is watching. How much longer do you intend to stall?" Her words sparked a wave of agreement. The clicks of camera shutters intensified, flashes flickering like needles piercing the mask of concealment. Malcolm lowered his head, voice barely audible. "We will review," but the unfinished sentence was lost in the murmur of disdain and disbelief. In that moment, no one asked another question. Everyone just stared at the screen, where the image of Miller shoving Darius had frozen at its most brutal point. The room seemed frozen too, so heavy that even each breath sounded loud. Reporters who had been noisy just moments earlier fell completely silent, leaving only the steady whir of cameras capturing every expression, every bead of sweat rolling down the police chief's face. The air was thick, as if the entire room had been locked inside a steel cage, with that video as the only key. A moment stretched endlessly. No one spoke, no one moved, only silence settled over everything. It wasn't the silence of agreement, but the silence of a verdict already delivered. Everyone in the room understood that from this minute on there was no longer any way for the police department to cover this up. The screen went dark, leaving behind a blank white wall, but the echo of that cruel sentence still rang inside every mind. And in that silence, the public's faith in official excuses collapsed completely. On the morning the hearing opened, the federal courthouse was packed. Long lines of people stretched from the gate, every step accompanied by hushed murmurs, eyes filled with curiosity and tension. The main courtroom glowed under bright lights. The national emblem, hanging high on the polished wooden wall, cast in a heavy, solemn atmosphere. Every seat was filled, from journalists and law students to ordinary citizens, all wanting to witness the moment justice would be laid bare. The silence was unusual, as if every cough, every turn of a page had become an event of importance. At the front, 3 chairs were arranged in the defendant's section. Miller and his 2 partners sat there, faces pale. They wore neatly pressed uniforms, but the clothing no longer symbolized power. It had become a flimsy shell hiding fear. Miller looked up, met the gaze of hundreds of camera lenses, then quickly looked down. His back was slightly hunched, hands clasped together, fingers tapping erratically. The man who once stood tall in uniform at the gas station was was now just someone awaiting judgment. Beside him, Jacob and Owen sat motionless, faces white as sheets, occasionally glancing at Miller with anxious eyes, as if hoping their former leader might shoulder the blame. The courtroom fell completely silent as the rear door opened. Darius Cole entered, long black robe trailing, each step firm, commanding. No one spoke, but the air shifted. Those who had watched the video, who had heard the insults, were now seeing the same man in a different light. He was no longer the handcuffed victim, but the presiding judge, the one with the authority to decide the path of justice. Countless eyes followed him, many heads nodding quietly, as if his presence alone proved that silence had been replaced with action. Darius stepped up to the high bench, placed the case file down, and scanned the room. His eyes were cold as they swept across the defendant's seats. Miller instinctively looked up, their eyes locking. A tense silence filled the space, like two opposing currents. Miller took a breath, trying to stay composed, but sweat was already soaking his collar. In that instant, he recalled the scene at the gas station when he shoved Darius against the car, thinking he held all the control. Now, everything had reversed, and in front of him was no longer a helpless man in the dark, but a federal judge wielding a power he could never touch. The gavel struck 3 times, sharp and final. The sound echoed through the room, cutting off the last remaining whispers. Court is now in session. Darius's voice rang out, calm but cold, freezing the air. The audience straightened in their seats. Reporters raised their pens and cameras panned across the room. On the defendant's bench, Miller swallowed hard, his hand gripping the edge of the chair, as if that sound alone had shattered all his remaining defenses. The opening moment needed no grand speeches. The presence of Darius and the silence of Miller were enough to set the tone. Justice was no longer confined to viral videos or chants in the streets. It now stood within this courtroom, and here, in front of hundreds of witnesses, the truth would be dissected, line by line, detail by detail, piece by piece. No one dared to breathe too loudly because they all understood that a new chapter of this case was beginning, and the silence that had once cloaked the night had completely vanished. As Darius stepped fully onto the raised bench, sunlight from the window cast down on his black robe, making it seem even more commanding. He stood tall, hand firmly on the polished wooden desk, eyes sweeping across the packed courtroom. Every pair of eyes followed him, not just with curiosity, but with expectation, with trust that the man once humiliated in public would now speak for thousands of unheard voices. The room was so silent, one could hear the faint rustle of paper as a reporter twisted a pen. Darius took a deep breath, then his voice rang out, clear and sharp like a blade cutting through the air. "Yesterday, you handcuffed me. Today, I judge you." The words dropped like thunder in a clear sky, shaking the entire room. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience, then erupted into a swell of noise, like a firestorm igniting across the chamber. A few people stood, clapping uncontrollably, while journalists swung their cameras into place, capturing the rare moment. Darius's words were not just a direct confrontation. They were a declaration that the scales of justice had tipped, and the truth would no longer be buried beneath layers of power. Miller sat at the defendant's bench, face pale as if all blood had drained from him. He tried to sit upright, but the words that had just been spoken made his entire body tremble. His gaze dropped to the floor, unable to meet the hundreds of eyes fixed on him. Jacob and Owen sat on either side, faces just as blank, their anxiety showing in every nervous glance. The uniforms they wore no longer carried pride, only the weight of shame, exposing the absurdity of men who once believed themselves above the law. Meanwhile, the courtroom became a sea of tangled emotions. Some people teared up, feeling those words strike straight to the heart, awakening years of buried injustice. A law student, seated near the back, clenched a fist and whispered to a friend, "This is why I chose law." An elderly woman, holding a Justice for All sign, patted her chest with trembling hands, a tear falling as she finally witnessed justice stand upright. The clatter of keyboards filled the air as reporters rushed to send breaking updates, the headline already forming, "Judge Cole faces the man who once handcuffed him." Darius raised the gavel and brought it down hard, the sound of wood echoing sharply, silencing the noise. The courtroom fell still. No one dared to speak again, but the weight of his declaration still lingered in the air. He looked directly at the three defendants, his gaze unwavering. "You will answer for your actions, and this time no darkness will shield you." The words carved themselves into the space. A mark could not be erased. The room erupted with emotion, yet was immediately subdued by the authority of the black robe. For a brief moment, people forgot that the man before them had once been humiliated, had once been thrown down, and saw only the figure of a judge standing firm, representing justice. And when Darius sat in the presiding chair, his eyes no longer saw them as individuals, but as defendants in a historic trial. The opening of the hearing needed no further ritual, because that one sentence had already shaped everything. It was the beginning of a journey that everyone in the room understood would allow no more cover-ups, no more escapes for those who once believed themselves untouchable. And in the brief silence that followed the outburst, the entire courtroom knew a verdict was forming, not just for individuals, but for an entire system. The courtroom had just quieted after Darius's declaration when Miller's defense attorney stood up, adjusted his tie, and stepped to the podium. He tried to keep his voice steady, but his darting eyes betrayed his tension. "Your Honor," he began, "what happened at the gas station that night was a misunderstanding. My clients acted on professional instinct when they perceived suspicious behavior. In a high-pressure environment, words can sometimes be misunderstood or taken out of context." Paused, scanning the room for a reaction, but was met only with cold, skeptical stares. The attorney continued, this time with a more pleading tone. "We must view this incident with fairness. The video that went viral has been seen by millions, but it only shows a small fragment of the entire event. When a single phrase is isolated, it becomes easy to misinterpret it negatively. I urge the court to consider this and avoid allowing public opinion to influence the proceedings." His words hung in the air, but landed with no weight. Several people in the gallery frowned. Some shook their heads, and murmurs began to rise, rejecting what he was trying to build. Darius sat still behind the bench, eyes following every word, every motion. As soon as the lawyer finished, Darius nodded slightly to the clerk. In an instant, the large screen behind them lit up, displaying the familiar footage. It was the very video that had rocked the public, showing Miller gripping Darius's shoulders and spitting out those venomous words. The courtroom erupted, whispers spreading across all corners, every eye locked on the screen. The audio rang out clearly, the words, "You're just black trash," crashing into the room like a sentence that needed no judge. The lawyer froze, mouth parted as if to speak, but no sound came. He turned toward Miller, whose face had gone pale, eyes darting as if searching for an invisible exit. Jacob and Owen stared down at the floor, hands clenched tightly, backs hunched as though trying to fold into themselves and disappear from the hundreds of eyes now fixed on them. Journalists aimed their cameras, pens scratched rapidly, keyboards clicked non-stop. Everyone understood that the defense's argument had just crumbled under the weight of that single clip. Darius waited for the murmurs to settle before speaking, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "This is not a statement taken out of context. This is undeniable evidence. What we all just heard, every one of us, was not imagined. It was real." His words echoed, each one etched into the wooden walls, making the air even heavier. In the audience, many shook their heads in anger, some with tears in their eyes, moved by the raw injustice laid bare before them. The defense attorney tried to regain his confidence, stammering, Perhaps we need to clarify the context further. Maybe that statement was metaphorical, or just a momentary outburst." But his voice was weak, fading into the whispers and stern stares that filled the courtroom. No one believed the excuse. Even in the eyes of the officer officers seated behind, disappointment was evident. They knew the truth had been exposed, and no argument was strong enough to cover it anymore. Darius tapped the gavel lightly, the sound echoing, restoring order. He looked up, eyes cold as steel, his voice firm. This courtroom is not for excuses. It is for the truth, and the truth has spoken. The statement landed like an exclamation point in the heavy atmosphere, leaving Miller and his co-defendants in utter silence, while the courtroom sank into the weight of having witnessed a moment that could not be undone. At the defense table, the silence that followed the video felt like an invisible verdict pressing down on each of them. Jacob sat in the middle, hands clasped, palms soaked with sweat. He bowed his head low, but then, involuntarily, looked up at Darius seated on the bench, his gaze blazing with authority. Jacob's lips trembled. Then, in a desperate reflex, he muttered just loud enough for Miller to hear, "We're done for." The small sound didn't carry beyond the long table, but it echoed in the minds of those involved, a quiet admission that every escape route had been sealed shut. Miller turned, eyes flaring, teeth clenched. He gave a slight nod, signaling Jacob to be quiet, but the trembling in Jacob's hands betrayed them both. Owen sat nearby, face drained of color, his expression hollow, like a man facing the edge. They had once believed the badge on their chest would shield them from any accusation, but today, with the evidence laid bare, silence was no different from a noose tightening around their necks. In the gallery, murmurs spread quickly. A few reporters noticed Jacob's lips move and immediately jotted notes, knowing that even a flicker of doubt could shift the narrative. Darius observed it all in silence, eyes locked on the three before him. He saw the fracture forming among them, saw the fear spreading like oil on water, and in that exact moment, he struck the gavel again, the sharp sound cutting through the noise. Darius's voice rang out, deep and resolute. This trial is not only to judge three individuals, but to expose the full truth behind them. I ordered a comprehensive internal investigation into the Southridge Police Department. The room exploded. Voices rose from every side, people leapt to their feet, eyes blazing, and reporters rushed to write and broadcast breaking news. In the gallery, a group of law students broke into applause, their clapping sharp at first, then swelling into a wave, defying the courtroom's solemnity. Miller sat motionless, both hands clenched into fists, tendons visible beneath the skin. He tilted his head, muttering curses under his breath, but only Jacob and Owen could hear. Meanwhile, Jacob trembled more, his eyes shimmering with tears as if waiting for the slightest opening to confess. Owen remained silent, his face like a hardened mask, but his rapid breathing betrayed a deep and rising tension. Darius looked straight down at the defendant's bench, his eyes sharp and cold as blades. Justice does not end with a single trial. It will dig into every corner, every file, every testimony. What you have done will be exposed, and no one is exempt. That statement closed the door on the defense's excuses and opened a new chapter for the entire case. Members of the press began calling it a turning point, the beginning of a true reckoning. Under the harsh glare of the camera lights, Darius's face appeared resolute, a stark contrast to the man once humiliated at a gas station in the dark. He didn't need to shout, didn't rely on grand words. A single clear command was enough to make the courtroom understand the game had shifted. This time, it wasn't Miller and his men in control, but justice itself, spoken through the voice of a judge, now held the reins. And Jacob's trembling, paired with Owen's hollow stare, were the first visible cracks in the wall of silence within the Southridge police force. The atmosphere in the courtroom was so tense that only the sound of flipping paper and the soft clicking of reporters' keyboards could be heard. Darius sat on the bench, his eyes following every movement of the three defendants. Jacob, the youngest officer in the group, was pale, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The light above caught the sweat rolling down his temple. Since the video had played, he could no longer maintain a hardened exterior, his body rigid, his eyes shifting constantly like someone trapped with no way out. The gavel struck, silencing the room. Darius firmly announced the expansion of the investigation, his voice echoing like the final key unlocking a door that had held back the truth. At that very moment, Jacob broke down, a choked sob rising clearly in the solemn chamber. All eyes turned to him. Miller snapped his head around, eyes blazing, gritting his teeth. "Shut your mouth." But Jacob couldn't hold it anymore. His trembling burst into collapse. He stood, legs unsteady, gripping the edge of the table as if to keep himself upright. His voice cracked, broken but clear. "Sergeant Miller told us to teach those black folks a lesson. He said they needed to know who was in charge. That night, we were just following orders." The courtroom froze. A few gasped. Others clenched their fists, the whispers swelling into a wave. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens racing, cameras zooming in on Jacob's tear-streaked face. Miller slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "You're lying! That's not true." But the outburst only laid bare his desperation. Darius raised his hand, voice calm but firm. "Order." Let him finish. Jacob lowered his head, a tear trailing down his cheek, his voice shaking yet urgent. "I didn't want to go through with it, but if I refused, I would have been transferred, would have lost my job. I know we were wrong, but that night I felt like I had no choice." He dropped back into his chair, covering his face, his sobs echoing through the courtroom. Nothing left to hide. The courtroom trembled, many stunned but fully aware that the truth was finally rising from the depths. A woman in the gallery wiped her eyes, whispering, "At last, someone had the courage to speak." A law student typed quickly on a laptop, words appearing on screen. "An officer admits racially motivated orders." The news spread instantly, reaching the square still packed with protesters. The chants outside roared louder. A chain reaction ignited from courtroom to street, unstoppable now. Darius looked directly at Jacob, his gaze firm but not cold. He understood that this testimony was not just a betrayal of Milbutut, but a release for a young soul long imprisoned by fear. He tapped the gavel gently, his voice carrying across the room. "This testimony will be entered into the official record. We have heard the truth." The sound rang out like a declaration. At the defense table, Miller hung his head, his fists clenched so tightly they turned purple. He no longer shouted, only simmered with a rage that boiled beneath the surface like a locked volcano spewing black smoke. Owen sat beside him, dazed, eyes shut tight, knowing that his silence would save no one. Behind them, reporters exchanged glances filled with excitement, having just witnessed a historic moment. The wall of silence within the police force had crumbled. The courtroom buzzed, but this time with the sweetness of vindication. No longer were the murmurs vague or speculative. People had heard the truth from the mouth of an officer involved. That truth could not be swallowed, could not be dressed up in eloquence. It rang out, raw and irreversible, and in Darius's eyes it was the moment justice had truly been reached, not through slogans or footage, but through the confession of one who had lived it. Jacob's confession was like a match thrown into a barrel of waiting fuel. The already tense courtroom erupted into a wave of outrage. People in the back rows stood in unison, shouting, "That was a racist order. They've lied to us for years." Some reporters dropped all pretense of composure, turning to each other in animated discussion, hammering at their keyboards to push out breaking updates. Cameras swept the room, capturing every expression, from Miller's blank stare to Jacob's tear-filled eyes. The atmosphere surged like a rising storm, tearing away every remaining veil. Outside the courthouse, the protest crowd began receiving the news. Live broadcasts fed the testimony into the square, where thousands held up signs and chanted Darius's name. When they heard the words, "Teach those black folks a lesson," a furious roar broke out. Many wept, some from pain, others because the truth had finally emerged. They chanted louder, their voices echoing against the glass facade of the courthouse. Justice! Justice! The wave of public outrage had moved beyond anger. It had become a movement, an unstoppable pressure forcing the entire system to confront itself. In the courtroom, Miller sat frozen, his eyes darting in confusion. He heard every murmur, every shout behind him, felt each arrow of fury aimed squarely at his back. His face had gone pale, sweat beading on his skin, yet he forced himself to stay silent. Owen, seated beside him, didn't dare lift his head, his hands clasped tightly, his back hunched as if carrying the weight of the entire room. In stark contrast, Darius sat tall, his gaze sharp as a blade. He didn't let the chaos sweep him away. Instead, he raised the gavel and struck it hard on the bench. The sharp crack echoed instantly across the courtroom, silencing the noise. "Order!" His voice rang out, clear and commanding. The room held its breath, all eyes locked on the bench. Darius swept his gaze across the room, from the public gallery to the press and then the defendants. The overhead light made his face appear even more resolute as he declared, "The truth cannot be buried. However hard you try to conceal it, it will rise, just as we have witnessed today." Each word fell like another blow of the gavel, etched into the wooden walls, etched into the hearts of those seated below. That sound didn't just silence the courtroom, it traveled outward, through the live broadcast, reaching millions watching from afar. Social media lit up, the phrase, "The truth cannot be buried," spreading rapidly, emblazoned across countless images, becoming the new rallying cry for the movement. People saw it as the boldest declaration yet, a signal that their long fight had finally found its voice. After the strike of that gavel, the atmosphere shifted entirely. No more mocking smirks, no more hollow defenses, only the solemn gravity of a trial everyone knew would be remembered. Darius sat upright, his gaze unwavering, and while the room was silent, inside each person, the wave of outrage and renewed conviction surged, refusing to be extinguished. This wasn't merely a judge delivering a verdict to a few defendants, it was a declaration to society itself that, once awakened, justice would never again be buried. Immediately after Jacob's testimony echoed through the courtroom, the Federal Oversight Committee launched an investigation. A special task force was sent to Southridge to review all case files from the past 10 years. Thousands of pages were pulled from storage, each line faded by dust and time, stacked high on the investigation tables. Within days, the preliminary findings stunned the entire team. Dozens of wrongful arrests surfaced, most involving people of color or members of minority communities. Old reports, ignored complaints, and unresolved files were all reopened, and the name Miller, along with his team, appeared repeatedly throughout the record. The news spread quickly, and major newspapers headlined the story with explosive titles. Southridge, a decade of abuse uncovered. Short but searing summaries, paired with scanned documents, sent shockwaves through the public. People read and shared the reports non-stop, realizing that suspicions once dismissed as paranoia were now backed by hard evidence. The truth tore through the veil like a blade, revealing the rot that had long festered in the dark. Past victims began to come forward. One middle-aged man recalled how, 10 years ago, Miller pulled him over on his way home from work, searched his car, and pinned a drug possession charge on him without evidence. He lost his job soon after, and his family fell into hardship. To this day, the psychological scars have never healed. A young mother choked up as she remembered being forced to kneel in the street one night just for asking why she was stopped. Her child witnessed it, and years later still panics at the sight of police. Each account cut deep into the public conscience, proving that Darius's case was not an anomaly, but the tip of a vast iceberg. Televised hearings showed victims testifying live, courtrooms filled with the sound of sobs, of choked voices recalling years of buried pain. A young Latino man stood before the camera, voice trembling but steady. "I got my nose broken at 17. My only crime was riding my bike too slowly through Miller's patrol zone. I filed a report, but it disappeared. Now I know why." His words made many in the room break down, their tears born not just of sympathy, but of rage that had been held in too long. Public pressure reached a boiling point. Thousands continued to march, now demanding justice not just for Darius, but for every nameless victim once buried and forgotten. The signs changed from "Justice for Darius" to "Justice for everyone." The media published photos of victims lined up outside the courthouse, each holding a placard summarizing their story. From those scrawled words, society saw clearly the corruption of a system that had long protected cruelty. In his office, Darius quietly read through every page of the committee's report. Each line felt like a weight on his chest, yet at the same time, it lit a fire inside him. He understood the case before him had gone far beyond the personal. It was now a battle to cleanse an entire system. When he stepped into the next courtroom, his eyes no longer focused solely on Miller, but looked further at those who had once signed off on the closed complaints, at the hands that chose silence. The justice he now represented was no longer his alone, but for every voice silenced over the years. The courtroom was packed during the announcement of the preliminary investigation results. When the committee representative read aloud the figure, over 30 wrongful arrests directly linked to Miller's unit, the entire hall erupted in outrage. Shouts rang out, applause mixed with tears, as everyone understood the curtain had fallen. Darius struck the gavel, his voice echoing like a final verdict. What was buried has surfaced. Justice will answer for the years of silence. And the courtroom responded with thunderous unity, a wave no power could now stop. National media outlets simultaneously released editorials with headlines like "Hammers Falling on Southridge's Decaying Machinery." The Washington Herald ran a bold front-page line, "The Justice Quake." Beneath it, a photo of victims lined up outside the courthouse, each holding a sign summarizing their story. Television networks replayed Darius's gavel strike, intercut with Jacob's confession and the trembling voices of those once wrongfully accused. On social media, the phrase, "the justice quake," spread like wildfire, dominating hashtags and being shared millions of times within hours. Every word, every image reflected the eruption of a movement, signaling this was no longer a personal case. It was a turning point for the entire system. While the public surged, the local police department descended into unprecedented turmoil. Officers who once saw Miller as a colleague now looked at one another with wary eyes, realizing anyone could be pulled into the investigation. Dozens of files were temporarily sealed, emergency meetings held constantly, but no one dared speak, the air thick with fear. Some longtime officers called in sick, avoiding the public eye, while younger ones floundered, unsure how to prove their own integrity. Calls flooded the department's hotline, most reviving old complaints, with some citizens yelling directly into the receiver, "How many years have you lied to us?" Chief Malcolm, once accustomed to standing confidently in front of cameras, now appeared on television with a pale face and sunken eyes. At the emergency press conference, he was bombarded with questions from reporters, ranging from covering for Miller to the cases buried over the past decade. He tried to deflect, but every excuse was immediately countered by concrete evidence already released by the press. The image of Malcolm, standing frozen in a ring of cameras, became a symbol of the collapse of a system once thought untouchable. The fallout spread beyond internal affairs. Surrounding towns came under pressure as citizens began questioning their own police forces. City councils were forced to speak up, promising internal reviews to avoid being swept up in the growing wave of anger. Protest images filled the streets, people holding signs that read, "We no longer trust Southridge Police." In the eyes of the public, the badge that once symbolized protection had now become associated with oppression and deceit. Darius followed it all from his office, newspapers scattered across his desk. He understood that the justice quake wasn't just ending a few careers, It was forcing an entire system to transform. Every testimony, every piece of evidence had gone beyond the trial he presided over, becoming a movement sweeping the country. The public pressure was now so immense that no one within the system could ignore it, and as he closed his eyes for a moment, he knew the road ahead would be difficult, but at the very least, the first steps had already shaken the ground. In the shadows of the Southridge precinct, many officers sat silently in their offices, eyes vacant. They knew public trust had fractured, and no matter how the investigations ended, that fracture would be nearly impossible to mend. Outside, the protesters' chants rang on relentlessly like a pounding drumbeat, a reminder that the age of cover-ups was over. And at the center of this quake, the image of Darius in his black robe had become a symbol, not just of a courtroom reversal, but of a society being forced to change. When the Federal Commission released its findings, the long-hidden files were stacked into thick folders, each one filled with damning evidence against Miller and his team. The federal court swiftly issued an official statement. Miller and his colleagues would be prosecuted on multiple charges, including abuse of power, unlawful arrest, assault, and systematic racial discrimination. The announcement was released overnight, and by the following morning, every major newspaper ran the same headline: Miller officially faces the law. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was completely different from the first day. This time, Miller no longer sat upright, defiantly scanning the room. He kept his head down, eyes weary, hair disheveled, like a man caught in a storm with no escape. Owen, beside him, could no longer maintain a cold facade, his hands clenched tight, face gaunt, while Jacob sat quietly, not saying a word, his hollow eyes drained after his tearful confession. They were no longer the three officers symbolizing the town's authority, but defendants awaiting judgment, burdened by charges they could not shake off. Their former defense attorney, after several failed hearings, finally stood before the press and admitted he could no longer represent them. He spoke briefly, his voice tired but firm. With the current volume of evidence, I have no way to continue. I'm withdrawing from the case. That statement marked the final end of any lingering hope for Miller's group. No one in the courtroom seemed surprised, as everyone knew the clumsy defenses had collapsed the moment the truth was revealed by one of their own. A few reporters even smiled bitterly, recording his withdrawal as the last crack in the crumbling wall of defense. Miller looked around, eyes filled with despair and a flicker of rage. He wanted to shout, to push back, but everything broke down into silence. Every past action, from handcuffing Darius at the gas station to the other wrongful arrests, had been laid bare. He understood now that the legal net had closed in, each knot tightening around him. The arrogance that once fed him was now replaced by fear, a fear clear in every glance, in every labored breath. Meanwhile, the public erupted with a sense of vindication. The people of Southridge, once silent out of fear, now stood together in front of the courthouse, raising signs and chanting for justice. Past victims emerged, interviewed by the press, their voices shaky but eyes shining. They knew that, finally, their years of suffering had been heard and acknowledged. Every story shared not only exposed the past but also served as a reminder that justice had begun to reach them, however late it came. Darius sat on the bench, his gaze unwavering. He didn't let personal emotion interfere, but inside every confession, every piece of evidence, every ruling being written was confirmation that justice was no longer a distant concept. This trial was no longer about whether Miller was guilty, but the final step to prove that the law still held the power to bind those who believed they stood above it all. And when the gavel struck, the air in the courtroom thickened, and everyone knew that those who once spread fear had truly been caught in the net of justice, a net that came late but never missed. When the attorney announced his withdrawal, the courtroom fell into tense silence. Miller suddenly stood up, hands trembling as they slammed onto the wooden table, the sound echoing like a last desperate grasp at lost power. His face flushed red, sweat breaking across his forehead, his voice hoarse as if choked. "We were just following orders." The cry tore through the quiet, like a trapped animal's scream. He lifted his head and looked around the courtroom, eyes wild, searching for sympathy. But all he received were cold, contemptuous stares. Those who had once stayed silent now felt nothing for his weak plea, knowing that phrase had long been used to excuse countless crimes throughout history. The room erupted in whispers, some scoffing, others shouting in anger. "What order told you to insult the innocent?" A middle-aged woman stood up, her voice choked but firm. "Then who ordered you to steal my son's youth?" The question struck Miller like blades, pushing him back, stammering without words. Owen stared down, and Jacob sat frozen, shoulders trembling under the weight of years of wrongdoing. Behind them, reporters kept their cameras rolling, capturing every moment, every expression, to share with the millions watching from afar. Darius slowly rose, standing tall in his black robe. His eyes swept across the courtroom, then stopped at Miller. His voice was steady but far-reaching, cold as steel. "An unlawful order is never an excuse." The words landed with finality, ending all defense, like the last handcuff closing on the narrow escape Miller had tried to cling to. The room went still, then erupted in thunderous applause. The clapping wasn't only for the judge's words, but a collective affirmation from society for a truth that could not be denied. Miller collapsed into his seat, both hands clutching his head, his face twisted in despair. He screamed in silence because even he understood that the response just given had shattered any hope of redemption. Darius no longer looked at him, because for him, this judgment was not about an individual, but about an entire system that had used orders as a shield to oppress citizens. His words rang out like a historic verdict, a reminder that justice does not accept cheap excuses built on fear or blind loyalty. The courtroom lit up with renewed belief. Victims who once trembled while telling their stories now held their heads high, feeling that their voices had been protected. A law student in the back row wrote down Darius's statement, knowing it would be quoted in textbooks and classrooms for years to come. The press immediately ran the headline, "An unlawful order is never an excuse. Judge Cole." The words broke through the courtroom walls, reaching the streets, touching thousands of protesters, and becoming a chant shouted without pause. In that moment, justice was no longer a distant concept, but the shared breath of a community, a warning to anyone who still clung to the illusion that orders could shield wrongdoing. And, at the center of that storm, Darius stood firm like a landmark, proving that once the truth is lit, nothing can extinguish it. Sentencing day arrived in an atmosphere thick like a storm that had been building for weeks. The federal courthouse was packed from early morning, long lines of people crowding the gates, some holding signs calling for justice, others silently waiting for a historic moment. Inside, every seat in the gallery was filled. Journalists and television crews sat shoulder to shoulder, their cameras fixed on the bench. The lights from the camera rigs lit the courtroom with a harsh glow, intensifying the tension, as if the whole country was holding its breath for the verdict. Miller was brought in, hands cuffed, his gaunt face a far cry from the arrogance of days past. The prison uniform made him appear small under the weight of hundreds of staring eyes. He no longer held his head high, no longer tried to challenge the crowd, but kept it bowed, his skin pale as paper. Owen followed, heavy and silent, while Jacob walked behind, head lowered, shoulders slumped like someone who had surrendered all will to resist. A whisper rose from the courtroom, quickly spreading into soft murmurs as people took in the contrast between the power they once held and the collapse now on full display. Darius emerged in his black robe, and the clerk's voice rang out, "This court is now in session for sentencing." The gavel struck the wood, silencing every sound. He sat upright, eyes scanning the room before settling on the defendants. His gaze held no hatred, only the stern weight of justice. A long silence passed before Darius spoke, his voice clear and firm. "The court has reviewed all evidence and testimony. We hereby sentence defendant Miller to 20 years in prison for abuse of power, assault, and systemic racial discrimination. Defendant Owen is sentenced to 15 years. Defendant Jacob, with mitigating consideration for his cooperation, is sentenced to 10 years. The courtroom erupted. Applause thundered, and many stood up. Tears streamed down the faces of victims who had once suffered in silence. They embraced, they cried, they smiled through the overwhelming emotion. Outside the courthouse, thousands of protesters heard the news through loudspeakers and burst into cheers, the celebration rippling across the plaza. News anchors went live immediately, and the headline, "Miller Sentenced," flooded screens nationwide, turning the moment into a historic turning point. Miller sat frozen, his face drained of color. He shook his head over and over, lips moving but no words coming out. Before him, the wall of justice had closed completely, with no gap left to slip through. Panic overtook him. His body trembled. His wild eyes darted for something to cling to, but met only contempt or indifference. Owen kept his head down, shoulders sunken, while Jacob sobbed aloud, tears streaming down his face, equal parts regret and relief that it was finally over. Darius looked directly down at them, his voice rising one final time, deep and steady. "This sentence is not only for past actions, but also a message that justice still exists, and anyone who disregards it will pay the price." That statement was recorded and instantly spread across social media, becoming the most quoted line in thousands of posts about the case. People called it the day faith was restored, the day justice ceased to be just a slogan and became reality. In that moment, the whole society realized that silence had ended. Those who once trembled in the presence of police could now hold their heads high, believing someone would stand up for them. And right in that room filled with camera lights, Darius Cole became the living symbol of justice, the man who turned personal humiliation into a beacon for the entire community. Cheers erupted like crashing waves as the sentencing echoed out into the square. Thousands stood packed outside, flags and signs waving high in the crisp air. Some broke into sobs, others hugged tightly in overwhelming emotion, and cries of "Justice for all" rang through the streets, blending with car horns and broadcast speakers. Many captured the moment on their phones, uploading it instantly, and within minutes, images of the crowd's outpouring of joy had flooded every platform. That euphoria stood as proof that trust had been restored, that justice had finally spoken. Among that sea of people were many past victims of injustice. They held up signs with their names, beneath the words, "We are heard," a declaration that the stories once buried had finally been acknowledged. An elderly man stood silently, tears rolling down his cheeks, then raised his fist high, a simple gesture carrying immense spirit. Children ran between their parents' legs, laughing, their innocent eyes unaware of the full meaning, yet destined to grow up remembering that today was the turning point in their town's history. Inside the courtroom, as all eyes turned to Darius, he stood, removed his judge's robe, folded it carefully, and handed it to an assistant. He stepped down the heavy stairs, his posture upright, his gaze calm. There was no victorious smile, no smug nod, only the quiet dignity of a man who had fulfilled his duty. The cheers from outside drifted through the windows, but his steps remained slow, his face revealing no hint of celebration. As the courtroom doors opened, the crowd erupted. Cameras were raised, phones held high. People called his name in celebration as if calling out to a symbol, but Darius's gaze remained calm, his deep eyes reflecting the sea of people shouting before him. He nodded to them gently, neither proud nor humble, simply offering a quiet response to the trust society had placed upon his shoulders. The crowd expected him to smile, but he didn't. He remained composed, as if understanding that the joy of this day could not erase the losses, nor make up for the years of injustice so many had endured. Reporters ran after him, flashes blinking non-stop, but Darius didn't stop to give a statement. He stepped down the final stair into the roar of chants and cheers, yet held on to his clarity. To him, this verdict was not an ending, but the beginning of a longer journey, one to rebuild the public's trust and, more importantly, to ensure justice would never again be buried in the dark. Amid the shouting crowd, Darius's composure became a haunting contrast. It reminded everyone that the justice won today was paid for in blood, sweat, and tears, and that the road ahead was still long. That stillness made his presence feel even more solid. Not just a judge delivering a sentence, but a pillar for society to lean on as it looked toward the future. The day after the sentencing, the national television network hosted an exclusive live primetime interview with Darius. Under the bright studio lights, millions of viewers across the country watched closely, waiting to hear from the man who had become a symbol of justice. The host sat across from him, calmly opening the segment. "Mr. Cole, the recent trial has shaken the nation. The public wants to know, what left the deepest impression on you?" Darius sat upright, his gaze steady but profound. He didn't answer right away. Instead, took a slow, deliberate breath, then spoke in a warm, measured tone. The greatest pain wasn't the handcuffs. It was the silence of the crowd. The words hung in the air, stilling the studio, and left viewers at home struck with emotion. Darius continued, eyes fixed on the camera as if speaking directly to each person watching. "When the 3 officers pulled me from the car, I felt humiliated. But that humiliation deepened when I looked around and saw faces watching, yet no one spoke up. I don't blame them. I understand how fear can paralyze a person, but it's that silence that enables evil." The host nodded, not interrupting, allowing him to finish. Darius recounted the moment of being escorted away, the stares from passers-by, and the biting loneliness he felt in that instant. He spoke slowly. "A society can only stand when its citizens have the courage to speak. If we stay silent, abuse of power will grow, and one day it will knock on anyone's door." Viewers at home began sending live messages to the program, and text crawled across the bottom of the screen. "We're sorry for staying silent. That sentence will stay with us forever." The host asked, "Do you have any regrets for having gone through all of this just to be here now?" Darius gave a faint, somber smile, not to mask the pain, but as an acceptance. "I regret the years that other victims had to suffer. I regret that justice came too late for them. But for me personally, had I not fallen the way I did, I might never have understood the full worth of rising. Justice is not theory from a book. It's the blood and tears of ordinary people." His words reached deep into the hearts of listeners. A young woman in the studio audience broke into tears, pulling out her phone to record the moment and post it online with the caption, "He spoke for all of us." The clip went viral within hours, garnering millions of views and hundreds of thousands of comments, with many people admitting they had once been the silent ones in the crowd and pledging never to be again. The interview ended with prolonged applause. The host closed with the words, "Perhaps the greatest message Mr. Cole leaves us with today is this: silence can become a form of guilt, and from this moment on, we are no longer allowed to look away." Darius gave a quiet nod, saying nothing more, but his eyes lit up as if offering a quiet hope that from pain, society might learn how to grow stronger. And that night, the entire country seemed to share one sentiment, that justice had found its voice, not through a courtroom, but through the hearts of those willing to face the truth. As the interview neared its end, the host asked Darius what message he wished to leave for the youth, for citizens across the nation, after all he had endured. He paused for a moment, his hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the lens as if speaking directly to the millions watching from living rooms, cafes, hospitals, or distant workplaces. Then, with a steady voice, he said, Justice is not some distant concept. Justice must come from action, not from stirring speeches, not from empty promises, but from each person willing to step forward, to speak a word of protest when witnessing injustice, to reach out and shield the vulnerable when they are being trampled. Justice does not exist on its own. Justice is sustained by the actions of each of us. As his words ended, the studio erupted into thunderous applause. The host nodded, eyes reflecting emotion, while many in the audience wiped away tears. But the true power of the message didn't remain within those 4 studio walls. It moved through the broadcast waves, into homes, into hearts. On social media, the phrase, "Justice must come from action," began appearing everywhere, printed on posters, painted on walls, written in blog posts, AND, more importantly, etched into the consciousness of millions. Across the country, community groups began organizing meetings, discussing how to monitor local police forces, and establishing hotlines to support victims of abuse. University students printed Darius's quote on shirts and banners, turning it into a rallying cry during peaceful marches. Even in sessions of Congress, some lawmakers quoted his words verbatim to push for legislative reform. A sentence that once seemed simple had become a guiding principle for a movement sweeping across the nation. In ordinary households, parents repeated that phrase to their children, teaching them that courage begins with the smallest acts, like refusing to look away from something wrong. In churches, those words echoed in sermons, affirming that justice is not a gift from above, but a responsibility humans owe to one another. Every social class, every community found in this message a piece of meaning that resonated with their own lives. The entire country was moved by the sincerity and strength in Darius's voice. People no longer saw him only as a judge sitting on the bench, but as a citizen who had endured humiliation and turned it into strength, reminding society that justice must be defended daily. The tears shed on screen were no longer tears of helplessness, but of faith rekindled. A new generation was learning how to rise, while older ones, once bowed down, were lifted by the belief that their voices mattered. That night, the whole nation seemed to breathe in unison. From cities to remote towns, people sat in front of their screens, repeating that phrase like an oath that, from now on, they would not remain silent. That emotion was more than just a fleeting wave. It became a quiet force, promising to push society toward a new chapter, one where justice is forged through real, everyday actions. After the live interview with Darius, the atmosphere across society was stirred by a surge of new energy. Schools quickly organized discussion forums, from university lecture halls to high school classrooms. Students gathered in groups, teachers led conversations, all centered around the phrase, "Justice must come from action." In each small room, personal stories were shared, and instances of injustice in local neighborhoods were brought to light. Many students, for the first time, realized that silence could become a form of guilt, and from there, they discussed how to find the courage to speak up when needed. There was no longer a gap between theory and real life. Instead, each conversation became a concrete step toward building civic responsibility. Community organizations didn't stand aside. Civil groups, religious associations, and even volunteer clubs expanded their forums. Older participants shared experiences of witnessing injustice, but lacking the courage to intervene, emotionally admitting that such silence had haunted them for years. The younger generation listened, then promised to do differently. These forums became bridges, erasing generational divides with a shared goal: to build a more just society. Each meeting ended with agreement on concrete actions, such as setting up hotlines for victims of abuse or offering basic legal skills classes for residents. Across city streets, the youth movement surged with power, no longer fueled by anger. This time it was peaceful marches, where thousands of young people held signs calling for an end to discrimination. They walked through markets, along main streets, chanting slogans about equality and justice. Music played from portable speakers, mixed with readings of Darius's quotes. Bystanders stopped to watch, many joining in on the spot, turning small marches into a seemingly endless river of people. The presence of youth brought with it a renewed vitality. They didn't just speak out, they pushed for tangible change, fundraising scholarships for minority students, calling for fair hiring practices in businesses, and promoting anti-bias media campaigns. Social media overflowed with images of young people arm in arm, wearing shirts that read, "We will not be silent." The hashtag tied to the movement reached tens of millions of shares, turning the message of justice into a widespread, positive current flowing into every corner of daily life. Change extended even into spaces once closed off. In churches, priests preached about justice, urging congregants to stand up against injustice. In companies, many leaders were forced to re-examine their hiring processes to avoid hidden bias. City councils held public meetings to hear from residents, something that had rarely happened before. The social atmosphere no longer stopped at outrage. It was transforming into concrete action, with hundreds of new initiatives emerging at once. Darius watched it all unfold on screen, saw young people holding banners high, saw determination in their faces, and he smiled gently. He understood that his story was merely the spark, while the real power came from a community brave enough to turn emotion into action. Amid the noise of thousands of voices shouting, perhaps the deepest message was this: justice does not belong to one person. It belongs to everyone. Amid the wave of marches and public discussions, something unprecedented occurred. Many young police officers began voluntarily appearing at open forums to express their commitment to changing how they engage with the public. On a simple wooden stage at a local university, one young officer stood before hundreds of students, his voice shaky but resolute. "We are trained to protect the community," he said, "but sometimes we forget that protection must come with respect. I promise from now on to act differently, to see every citizen as an equal human being, not a target to control." The room erupted in applause, and many students stood in support. His words were not an empty promise, but a sign that a new generation within law enforcement was beginning to recognize its responsibility in the face of public pressure and their own conscience. In other cities, groups of young officers sent open letters to the press, acknowledging the existence of bias and pledging to change. One letter, widely shared, bore the bolded line, "We do not want to become the next Miller." That message struck a chord with millions, because it showed that within a system once seen as cold and unjust, there were still people willing to admit wrong and move toward what is right. Many citizens who had lost faith began to believe that perhaps real change was starting from within the very force so heavily criticized. From those commitments, a new movement was born, known to the community by a simple but powerful name: Blue with Justice. The movement brought together both police officers and civilians, organizing activities to rebuild trust. They marched peacefully, side by side, joined open forums on equality, and even collaborated on community projects like repairing homes for low-income families or hosting self-defense workshops for women. The rise of this movement painted a new picture. Police were no longer seen solely through the eyes of resentment, but were gradually returning to the role of partners with the people. The movement spread rapidly through social media. Images of young officers linking arms with residents at community events flooded the internet, receiving millions of likes and comments. The slogan, "Blue with Justice," appeared on t-shirts, flags, and posters. Children in neighborhoods ran around holding small signs with the phrase, while parents felt a little more at ease, believing their kids would grow up in an environment with less fear. This change wasn't a magic fix that erased the past, but it showed a society striving to heal. From deep cracks in trust, a green shoot of hope was beginning to grow. And in the evenings, under the glow of streetlights, people no longer saw officers just standing silently on the corners. They saw them sitting down with locals, sharing meals, listening to the stories of those who had once trembled in their presence. It was the clearest proof that change, when nurtured through action, can become a movement strong enough to rewrite the history of a community. Months after the historic verdict was delivered, the gas station where it all began had become a special landmark in the hearts of Southridge residents. On the old concrete ground, right next to where Darius was dragged from his car and handcuffed in front of the crowd, the community erected a small granite plaque. Engraved on it were 4 clear words: "Justice never sleeps." The plaque was neither large nor flashy, but every carved line carried the weight of memory and the flesh and blood of those once oppressed. Each time the evening sun cast its light, those words stretched long shadows across the ground, serving as a lasting reminder. People began turning the site into a meeting place of collective memory. They came to light candles every weekend evening, soft yellow glows reflecting on the faces of those gathered. Elderly citizens with canes stood watching, their clouded eyes still gleaming with emotion. Children ran around holding slips of paper with the slogan, not yet understanding its meaning but sensing the sacredness in the air. Songs rose from a group of young people, voices clear as they sang about justice and freedom. The old gas station became a space for belief, for memory, and for a new beginning. Many who had witnessed Darius's arrest returned to the site. They stood silently before the plaque, some crying, others whispering late apologies for their silence that day. These quiet confessions were written into a memory book placed nearby, open to anyone wishing to share their thoughts. The pages filled quickly with words of apology, gratitude, and promises never to remain silent again. Through each line, it became clear that the power of memory had been transformed into a commitment for the future. Journalists from across the country came to report on the Justice Memorial in Southridge. Images of hundreds of flickering candles in the dark, people holding hands in prayer, were broadcast nationwide and moved audiences deeply. Other communities began erecting their own memorials for injustices that had occurred in their towns, creating a growing network of light, so that anyone passing by would remember justice is not something that exists by default. It must be defended and upheld through action. Darius, too, once quietly returned to that gas station. He brought no entourage, no media. He simply stood before the plaque, placed a candle down, and left. The moment was captured by a passerby from afar, and the photo quickly spread across social media, captioned simply, "He hasn't forgotten." The image of Darius standing silently by a small flame, his face contemplative, touched millions, for it showed that he was not just a distant symbol, but a man carrying memory and pain, willing to share it with the community. That gas station, once a place of humiliation, had now become a symbol of renewal. Each candle lit served as a reminder that justice never sleeps, that wounds, though they may never fully heal, can become beacons to guide the way. And, in the stillness of suburban evenings, the flickering flames continued to illuminate a message. From the darkness, justice has awakened, and it will never again allow itself to fall asleep. The story of that gas station was no longer just the memory of a small community, but a symbol spreading across the nation. Major newspapers repeatedly referenced it as a prime example of justice reversed, where those who once abused power were forced to bow before their victims. In law schools, professors incorporated the case into their lectures, not only as a legal precedent, but as a moral lesson on every citizen's duty in the face of injustice. People everywhere began calling it the reversal of justice, a phrase echoed in public forums and peaceful protests, as a source of inspiration that no matter how powerful the oppressors, truth and justice will eventually find their way. The small plaque at the gas station became a destination for people from afar. They came to see the words, Justice never sleeps, carved into stone, to take a photo, to light a candle, and to carry home a piece of spiritual strength. Artists began writing songs, painting murals, and even staging plays based on the case, turning it into a new cultural legacy of the era. These works did not glorify any one person, but celebrated the spitha tatha. While justice may be delayed, it can never be buried. While public attention continued to surge with memorials, articles, and songs, Darius chose to step back from the spotlight. One evening, quietly returned to the gas station. The air was crisp, and the wind sweeping across the open lot made the candle flames dance. Wearing a light jacket, his figure blended into the crowd, unnoticed as the man who had once endured a nightmare in that very place. He walked slowly past the plaque, paused for a few seconds, eyes reflecting deep thought, then moved on. No cameras flashed, no voices called his name, only his silhouette merged with the line of people like any ordinary citizen. That silence was his choice. Darius didn't need applause because he understood that justice doesn't belong to one face or one title, but to all who dare to defend it. He left behind a symbol for society, then quietly moved on, as if to remind everyone that the story shouldn't end with one individual, but must continue in every heart. That image, though never captured by any camera, lives on as a beautiful scene in the minds of those who know that Judge chose silence so that justice wouldn't be turned into a personal legend. And so, among the crowds that still gathered to remember, there was a figure who blended in, walking calmly, leaving no sound behind. It was a quiet but weighty period at the end of a story that had become a symbol, a reminder that justice doesn't only live in the moments of public acclaim, but also in the quiet resolve of those who choose to live by it every day. As time passed, the echoes of the gas station incident continued to resonate throughout society. Many still mentioned Darius's name as a reminder of the moment justice turned, but he chose to live quietly, focusing on his work and continuing to serve as a judge. One day, he decided to write it all down, not to praise himself, but to preserve what he had experienced as a lesson for future generations. The memoir, simply titled Justice Never Sleeps, was born out of long nights at his desk, the yellow lamp casting light onto the page, each line unfolding slowly like a conversation with himself and with the world. In the memoir, Darius recounted every detail, from the moment he was stopped at the gas station, the pain of seeing his belongings thrown to the ground, to the heavy silence of the crowd that made him feel utterly alone. He didn't shy away from personal wounds, even admitting there were moments when he wanted to give up, but those very moments helped him understand the true value of perseverance. He wrote about standing in court, not as a victim, but as the presiding judge, and the moment of delivering the verdict became a lasting reminder that the truth cannot be silenced. The book was more than a recounting. It was a collection of lessons. He devoted many pages to the silence of the crowd, the fear that bound people, and emphasized that only when a community dares to speak up can justice truly endure. He wrote, "I once resented that silence, but later I understood what matters is not blame, but awakening courage. If one person dares to step forward, then there will be a second, then a third, and eventually the whole society will no longer stand by." These words made readers feel personally addressed, entrusted with responsibility, and inspired to act. When the memoir was published, it quickly became widely read. Not only legal professionals, but ordinary people held it in their hands, reading and finding in it a reflection of their own stories. Schools added it to reading lists, and many professors use it as a vivid example to teach students about the value of justice. Young people passed around quotes from the book, especially the closing line that brought many to tears. That day, justice chose to speak. Readers didn't approach the book as a closed story, but as a mirror to reflect on themselves. Some admitted that, thanks to its pages, they found the courage to speak out when witnessing injustice in everyday life. Others found comfort because finally someone had voiced the pain they once endured. The memoir didn't simply close a chapter. It opened a long dialogue between the past and the future. And as they turned the final page, people understood that what Darius wanted to leave behind wasn't the glory of a verdict or the praise he received, but the message that justice always needs protectors, always needs voices from brave hearts. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a citizen who had endured humiliation and turned it into strength to remind society. His journey became proof that justice, even when it sleeps, will awaken when someone chooses to give it voice. In the final pages of the memoir, Darius wrote briefly, but with weight. Justice only exists when people dare to stand up. The words were not flowery, didn't rely on complex arguments, but struck like a final hammer blow etched into the reader's mind. He didn't want justice to be seen as something distant, belonging only to courts or laws, but as something that begins with each person's smallest action, the courage to speak up when facing injustice, to reach out to the vulnerable, to resist when the powerful oppress. To him, justice was shared courage, a responsibility spreading from the individual to the community. And without those voices, society would once again sink into the darkness of silence. Readers, upon closing the book or turning off the interview, often paused for a moment of reflection. They didn't just remember the image of a wrongfully handcuffed black man, but looked inward. Some recalled moments they had turned away instead of stepping in. Others remembered when they lowered their heads before injustice out of fear of trouble, and deep down, they all realized that if they wanted a better society, they had to learn how to step forward. The lesson didn't come from theory, but from a real story etched into people's hearts with blood, tears, and silence finally broken. The echoes of the incident didn't end with a book or a verdict, but continued to live in daily life. Each time someone witnessed injustice, that sentence echoed in their mind as a call to action. Schools printed the quote on classroom walls so students would see it every day. Community groups adopted it as a slogan for campaigns protecting the vulnerable. Those who once stayed silent now saw in those words a chance to begin again, to redeem their hesitation with firmer action. Across social media, messages poured in. One wrote, "I once stayed silent when I saw someone being bullied. Today, I promise never to repeat that mistake." Another shared, "Justice belongs to no one alone. It lives through us." These words were shared thousands of times, spreading the message like a quiet fire that never fades. That very spread became the deepest echo, turning the story into more than just a courtroom case. It became the beginning of a long-lasting movement. And so, from a small gas station on the outskirts, from the wrongful handcuffing and the cold eyes of those who abuse their power, a lesson was written in truth. That lesson proved that justice doesn't come from passive waiting, but from the courage to step forward, even with small, trembling steps. The people of Southridge learned to stand, and through them, the entire nation followed. The echo remained in every person, reminding them that if darkness ever returned, they would not be allowed to stay silent. The story ends, but its echoes keep ringing. Readers close the book, viewers turn off the TV, mourners leave the memorial, yet that reminder stays in their minds. Perhaps that is the true power of justice, not in a single verdict, but in its ability to take root in the human heart, so that one day, when facing injustice, they will remember and choose to stand. And in that moment, justice will never sleep. From one dark night at a gas station where Darius Cole was dragged from his car by 3 abusive officers, the story unfolded as a series of trials marked by humiliation, loneliness, and the terrifying silence of the crowd. The man, once seen as suspicious, later appeared as a federal judge, seated at the bench of justice to try the very men who had cuffed him. That reversal didn't just ignite public outrage, it exposed the deep cracks in a system where bias and power had crushed countless lives. Leaked videos, waves of fury online, and eventually, public trials made the truth impossible to bury. The whole nation watched as once arrogant men were forced to bow before the truth, and from that moment, justice became not a distant concept, but the breath of the community. Yet, the story didn't end with the verdict against Miller and his team. It went further, becoming a flame in the hearts of citizens, teaching them that silence is the fertile ground where injustice grows. From schools to churches, forums to streets, people repeated Darius's words like an oath. Justice only exists when people dare to act. Young officers began to change on their own. Community movements spread, and in many places, small memorials were raised to remind everyone that justice never sleeps. Southridge was no longer remembered as a dull suburb, but as the place where a movement for true reform began. That journey leaves a profound lesson for anyone who witnessed or listened. Darius never claimed to be a hero. He was simply a citizen who chose to stand when given the chance. But his quiet resolve proved that justice doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to all who dare to defend it. The lesson is clear. Every small action, every voice that dares to rise carries the power to change society. Justice is not a gift handed down from above, but the result of collective courage. As the story closes, readers carry with them a heavy yet hopeful echo. Darius Cole faced the trial with quiet strength and will, leaving behind not a legacy of personal power, but a torch to light the way for others. And the lasting lesson remains. Justice only exists when people choose to stand, because silence in the face of injustice is a betrayal of the future.